The winter solstice banquet was supposed to be the moment Cailan Thorne honored his chosen mate before the entire kingdom. Instead, it became the exact second Genevieve's entire world shattered into unrecognizable shards of ice. She stood at the base of the massive obsidian dais in ceremonial white, dressed in silk and silver, waiting for the man she loved to speak her name. Her pulse maintained a steady, quiet rhythm against her throat. The banquet room of the Obsidian Citadel was a cavern of ancient stone, vaulted ceilings, and roaring hearths, filled with the murmurs of 500 wolves of the sovereign court. She had spent 3 agonizing weeks orchestrating every detail of this night. Her hands, though hidden in the heavy folds of her velvet skirt, still bore the faint, stinging burns from hovering over the massive iron cauldrons in the lower levels. She had personally ensured the amber broth was steeped to absolute perfection. It was a secret recipe, laced with the subtle, hidden heat of her own dormant weaver magic. It was the only remedy that kept Cailan's blood from freezing solid during the age of the Great Frost. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the sanctuary groaned open. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. Cailan stepped into the flickering torchlight. His presence commanded the vast, echoing room, carrying an aura of absolute, crushing winter that silenced every conversation, every clinking goblet, every breath. Frost clung to the ragged edges of his dark wolf fur mantle, a terrifying, physical manifestation of the curse eating away at his soul. The sovereign looked magnificent and lethal. Genevieve took a small step forward, but he did not look at her. He was not walking alone. Odette Morveth clung tightly to his right arm. The rival noble was draped in crimson silk that seemed to bleed against the stark greys and blacks of the royal court, her neck heavy with diamonds. Her lips curved into a smile of pure, concentrated venom as she locked eyes with the woman, standing alone at the base of the steps. Genevieve felt the collective gasp of the kingdom ripple through the cold stones beneath her feet. 500 witnesses. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the magnificent ruler to the stoic woman waiting in the shadows. Cailan walked past her. He did not pause. He did not flinch. He guided his companion up the stone steps, his molten amber eyes fixed straight ahead on the high table. He reached the summit. He pulled out the massive, wolf-carved chair that had belonged to generations of queens, and he seated the ambitious lady in the Luna's place. Ignorance breeds simple, easily forgivable errors. Conscious cruelty, however, requires deliberate intent, and the sovereign had executed his public betrayal with wide-open eyes. Genevieve felt the biological mate bond, the invisible golden thread that had tethered her soul to his for 3 grueling years, pull violently taut. It did not stretch gracefully. It groaned under the crushing weight of the public humiliation, freezing over with the same dark ice that cursed his veins. Deep inside her chest, something ancient and quiet finally gave way. The bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. It sounded like a breaking bone in her ears. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone in the Obsidian Citadel expected her to crumble. They waited for the weak, powerless girl from the fringes of the territory to weep, to fall to her knees on the hard stone, to beg the sovereign for a reason why she was being discarded like rubbish. She did none of those things. Genevieve simply smoothed the silk of her skirt with steady, untrembling hands. She looked up at the man sitting on the throne, her expression a mask of perfect, impenetrable calm. She turned her back on the dais, and she walked away into the shadows of the corridor, leaving the dead silence behind her. The eastern wing of the citadel had always been neglected, a place where the hearths drafted poorly, and the stone walls wept with damp, biting cold. It was fitting that Cailan had placed her here, far away from the insulated warmth of his own opulent quarters. Genevieve pushed open the heavy wooden door to her chambers and did not bother to light a single candle. The pale moonlight, bleeding through the frosted window panes, was more than enough. There was no frantic rushing, not weeping, not begging. She moved with the deliberate, measured grace of a ghost preparing to haunt a completely different graveyard. She pulled a single worn canvas travel bag from beneath the massive, empty four-poster bed. Into it went 3 thick wool tunics, a pair of sturdy leather winter boots, and a heavy travelling cloak. She tucked her ancient moonflower, Sigil, safely beneath the collar of her tunic. She left the imported silk gowns hanging perfectly straight in the armoire. She left the jewel-encrusted hair combs sitting untouched on the vanity. She reached for her left hand. The metal suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Genevieve slid the silver ring off her finger. The simple mating band hit the scarred wood of the dressing table with a dull, hollow clink. It was the only sound in the freezing room. She did not look back as she slung the bag over her shoulder and slipped out the door. She moved on swiftly toward the secret. Narrow corridors built into the walls of the keep, designed centuries ago for unseen servants. The descent was long, winding down through the dark bones of the citadel, until the biting chill of the upper floors gave way to the heavy, spiced warmth of the lower levels. She emerged from a concealed doorway into the sprawling kitchens. The fires here never truly died, casting long, dancing shadows across the hanging copper pots and bloody butcher blocks. It was supposed to be completely empty while the feast raged up above. It was not. Martha Sterling stood up by the massive stone ovens, a wooden paddle clutched in her flour-dusted hands. The elderly cook froze, her tired, kind eyes dropping instantly to the canvas bag, slung over the younger woman's shoulder. Martha was the only creature within these black walls who had ever spoken to her without a layer of poisoned honey or outright disdain. For a terrifying, stretched heartbeat, the silence held. All Martha had to do was scream. One shout to the royal guards patrolling the outer courtyard, and Genevieve would be locked in the underground dungeons for treason against the crown. Martha lowered the wooden paddle. The old woman did not say a single word. She moved to the back pantry with a heavy, limping gait, emerging a moment later with a large burlap sack. She stuffed it aggressively with hard rye bread, cured salted meats, and a thick leather flask of fresh water. Martha walked over, her weathered, scarred hands trembling violently as she shoved the provisions into the travel bag. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swimming with unshed tears, silently mourning the quiet girl she had come to love like a daughter. Genevieve reached out and gently touched the old cook's wrinkled cheek, offering a single fleeting smile of absolute gratitude. It was a silent, permanent goodbye. Martha shuffled to the heavy iron door at the very back of the kitchens, the servants' gate, that led directly out into the unforgiving wilderness of the Whispering Ridge. She pulled the massive iron bolt back with a heavy grunt. The door swung outward. The raging winter storm howled immediately into the warm room, bringing a violent spray of biting snow. Genevieve stepped over the stone threshold, pulling her cloak tight around her neck, and let the screaming blizzard swallow her whole. 24 hours passed. The obsidian citadel was rapidly unraveling. The banquet hall, usually a bastion of intimidating majesty and flawless execution, had descended into a chaotic, freezing mess. The evening dinner was entirely disorganized. The grand hearth fires, usually coaxed to roaring heights by unseen hands, sputtered and choked on damp wood, plunging the vast space into a bitter, biting chill. High-ranking nobles pulled their thick furs tighter around their throats, casting anxious, highly irritated glances toward the high table. Odette sat in the Luna's chair, complaining loudly and endlessly about the raw, bloody taste of the venison, her sharp voice grating painfully against the echoing stone walls. At the center of the dais, the sovereign sat completely rigid. Cailan was suffocating inside his own skin. The curse buried deep in his marrow was no longer a dormant, manageable threat. It was a violent, thrashing beast trying to claw its way out. Frost physically crept up the back of his neck, hardening his muscles, making every single breath feel like inhaling a lungful of crushed glass. The amber broth served to him tonight was completely wrong. It was watery, bitter, and entirely lacked the strange, lingering, magical heat that always miraculously soothed the terrible ice in his veins. He pushed his silver goblet away. The thick metal actually cracked under the monstrous force of his grip. He assumed Genevieve was simply hiding. He assumed she was throwing a petulant, quiet fit, locking herself in her chambers to punish him for elevating another woman to secure the critical Western border alliance. She was supposed to understand her place in the hierarchy. She was supposed to bear the political indignity quietly for the good of the Pack's survival. Her anger, sharp and hot, flared through his freezing chest. Cailan stood up abruptly, his heavy chair scraping violently against the polished stone floor. He did not offer an excuse to the startled nobles or the whining woman sitting beside him. He descended the dais in long, predatory strides, the temperature of the room seemingly dropping further with every furious step he took. He stormed through the vaulted, torch-lit corridors, his heavy boots echoing like war drums against the walls. He would drag her out of her room if he had to. He would remind her of her sworn duties to the crown, to the Pack, and to him. He reached the eastern wing. The hallway was unnaturally dark and silent. Cailan grabbed the iron handle of her heavy oak door. He shoved it inward with enough brutal force to crack the iron hinges. The words died instantly on his tongue. The air in the bedroom was stale and significantly colder than the blizzard raging outside the glass. There was no fire in the grate. There were no lit candles. The massive four-poster bed was perfectly made, completely untouched. He stepped over the threshold, his inner wolf suddenly prowling close to the surface, sensing a profound, horrifying absence. He tore open the heavy wooden armoire. Silk dresses hung perfectly straight in the dark, smelling faintly of old dust rather than her signature. Intoxicating scent of moonflower and cedarwood. She wasn't hiding. Cailan turned slowly, his glowing amber eyes frantically scanning the dark shadows of the room until they locked onto the small dressing table. There, sitting dead center on the scarred wood, gleaming faintly in the pale moonlight, was the silver ring. The floor seemed to completely vanish beneath his heavy boots. The powerful ruler staggered forward, his large hand reaching out with a noticeable tremor to touch the small loop of discarded metal. It was ice cold. The realization crashed into his skull with the devastating force of a falling mountain. He reached inward, grasping blindly for the tether of their biological mate bond, desperately searching for the quiet, steady presence that had always lingered in the back of his mind, keeping him sane. There was nothing, just a gaping, bleeding void where her soul used to be. Yesterday, he watched her leave, like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest, completely blind to the agonizing truth until this very second. He had not just broken her heart for a political alliance. He had driven her away entirely. Cailan stood entirely alone in the freezing dark, clutching a meaningless piece of jewelry, realizing for the very first time that without her, he was completely and utterly doomed. 5 years later, the wind screaming through the jagged peaks of Whispering Ridge sounded entirely different from the hollow drafts of the obsidian citadel. It was a punishing, unforgiving cold. It stripped the timberline bare and buried the small border village under feet of dense snow for 6 months of the year. Yet, inside the modest wooden cabin, the air hung thick with the comforting scent of crushed pine needles, boiling water, and dried yarrow. Genevieve Vance moved gracefully across the uneven floorboards, her hands deftly sorting a pile of pale winter roots. She was no longer the silent, trembling girl wrapped in imported silk who had walked out into a blizzard. She wore simple, durable wool. Her long hair was tied back with a rough leather strap. The villagers here knew her only as the quiet healer from the south, a woman who asked no questions and demanded no respect, but who had single-handedly kept the frost fever from decimating their children. She had built this sanctuary from absolute nothingness, brick by brick and fire by fire, not used, not owned, chosen. In the corner of the warm room, sitting cross-legged on a patched bearskin rug, Lyra Thorne was meticulously braiding a long strip of raw sheep's wool. The little girl was tiny for her age, possessing a delicate intuition that bordered on the supernatural. She hummed a low, tuneless melody under her breath. Her small fingers moved with an instinctual speed that mirrored the ancient weaver magic dormant in her mother's blood. Lyra was profoundly sensitive to the dropping temperatures, always the first to pull her heavy shawl tighter around her shoulders, hours before the dark storm clouds actually breached the mountain peaks. Right now, she was perfectly content, bathed in the radiant warmth of the massive stone hearth. The fire was always burning. The mother ensured it never went out. Standing by the frost-covered window, peering out into the fading grey light of the afternoon, was her brother. Bram Thorn did not play with wool or sit idly by the fire. He possessed a terrifying stillness that did not belong on a 5-year-old child. He stood with his small shoulders squared, his brow furrowed as he watched the tree line with calculated focus. The boy turned his head slightly toward the glass. The pale winter light caught his features, illuminating the striking molten amber eyes that were a direct, undeniable mirror of the sovereign who had discarded them. He had the same sharp jawline, the same heavy, brooding silence. Genevieve paused her grinding, watching her son trace a pattern on the frosty pane. The wall inside her chest is gone. She has not built another. She simply poured all her remaining warmth into these 2 small breathing anchors, ensuring they would never know the crushing isolation of the royal court. She walked over to the wooden basin, wiping herbal residue from her palms with a rough linen cloth. She crossed the room and gently brushed a smudge of hearth ash from Lyra's cheek. Genevieve then moved to the window, placing a warm hand on her son's tense shoulder. Bram leaned into her touch immediately, his eyes never leaving the tree line. He pointed a small, steady finger toward the dark canopy of evergreens. The shadows out there were shifting, erratic and desperate against the stark white of the snow. A heavy sense of foreboding settled in the pit of the healer's stomach. The storm outside escalated with brutal force. A violent gust of wind rattled the heavy iron hinges of the cabin shutters. Before Genevieve could pull her children away from the glass, a frantic, thunderous pounding erupted against the thick oak of the front door. It did not wait for an answer. The door was kicked open with a splintering crack. The screaming blizzard erupted into the quiet sanctuary, dragging a violent swirl of biting snow and freezing wind across the floorboards. Lyra shrieked, dropping her woven wool and scrambling backward behind the heavy oak table. Bram instantly stepped in front of his sister, his small fists clenched. His amber eyes blazed with defensive fury. Blocking out the fading daylight was a massive warrior covered in dark blood and packed snow. His silver-plated armor was dented. His breathing was ragged. He was carrying a towering, unconscious figure slung over his broad shoulders. Genevieve froze entirely. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. She knew that scarred, battered face immediately. Hess Caldress, the steadfast commander of the Royal Guard, stumbled over the threshold, his heavy, blood-soaked boots leaving dark crimson footprints on the clean wooden planks. He was in a state of absolute, blind panic. He did not recognize the modest cabin. He did not recognize the woman standing in the shadows of the apothecary shelves. He only saw the glowing hearth and the jars of medicine. He barked a desperate order into the room, demanding the village healer step forward and save his bleeding lord. The royal patrol had been ambushed by border rogues. They were completely cut off. Genevieve moved with a detached calmness. She snatched a heavy, woven grey shawl from the back of a chair and pulled it deep over her head, leaving her features completely veiled. She pointed a single, commanding finger toward the reinforced wooden examination table in the center of the room. The commander did not hesitate. He lunged forward and deposited his massive burden onto the thick planks. The wood groaned in protest under the weight. The injured man rolled onto his back, his head falling limply to the side. Frost clung to the ragged, blood-stained edges of his dark wolf fur mantle. His face was deathly pale. His lips were tinted a horrifying shade of blue. The terrible freezing curse had completely overtaken his body, crawling up the veins of his neck like shattered glass beneath his skin. Caelan Thorn was dying. The sovereign looked hollowed out, stripped of his terrifying majesty, reduced to a broken, suffocating creature, losing a war against his own blood. Genevieve stared down at the man who had shattered her entire existence. Her pulse maintained a steady, quiet rhythm against her throat. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She merely assessed the catastrophic physical damage with the cold eye of a seasoned medic. Hess grabbed the edge of the wooden one, but his massive hands trembling. He pleaded with the shrouded woman, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his failure. He confessed that the king had been deteriorating for years. Without the proper aber broth, that the curse was finally freezing his heart solid, and the rogue ambush had pushed his failing body over the edge. "Caring about you is killing me," the commander whispered to his unconscious lord. A desperate, broken admission of his endless loyalty. Hess begged the healer to do whatever it took, offering gold, royal pardons, atonement. He just needed Sovereign to survive the night. Genevieve did not speak. She kept her face angled away from the hearth light. She gestured sharply toward the back door of the cabin, silently ordering the bleeding command to go outside, secure the perimeter, and tend to his surviving men. She could not work with him hovering. Hess hesitated for a fraction of a second, his protective instincts warring with his desperate need for medical intervention. He looked at the dying king, then back at the silent, veiled woman. With a heavy, defeated nod, the commander turned and dragged himself back out into the raging blizzard, pulling the splintered door shut behind him. The clinic was plunged into an oppressive silence, save for the crackle of the fire and the wet, rattling breaths of the dying Sovereign. Genevieve stood perfectly still over the examination table. The smell of his dark, coppery blood mixed sickeningly with the raw, biting scent of winter frost. She slowly pushed the heavy grey shawl off her head, letting it pool around her shoulders. She looked at the deeply lined, exhausted face of the man who had cast her aside. There was no political court here to witness her humiliation. There was no Odette Morvath sitting in a stolen chair. There was only a freezing, broken wolf, bleeding out on a wooden table. She reached beneath the collar of her simple tunic. Her fingers brushed against the ancient stone of the moonflower, sigil resting against her collarbone. The artifact was already humming, reacting violently to the proximity of the curse it was meant to destroy. Genevieve took a slow, deep breath, pulling down the massive mental walls she had erected around her core. She let the suppressed, dormant Weaver magic flood into her veins. It felt like swallowing a mouthful of pure, scorching sunlight. The heat traveled down her arms, gathering heavily in the palms of her stained, scarred hands. There is no wolf too broken to be worthy. She stepped forward and pressed her bare hands directly flat against Kaelin's broad, freezing chest. The physical shock of the contact was absolute agony. The supernatural ice of his curse bit aggressively into her skin, trying to flash freeze her fingers to his ruined armor. Genevieve gritted her teeth, refusing to pull away. She forced her blazing, golden magic downward, pushing the intense heat straight through his ribs and directly into his failing heart. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Deep beneath the layers of trauma, exile, and unbroken silence, the severed biological mate bond suddenly sensed the familiar, intoxicating heat of its missing half. It did not merely wake up, it violently erupted. An invisible, heavy shockwave of pure tactile sensation blasted through the small room, rattling the glass jars on the shelves and making the hearth flames roar twice as high. It felt like a dormant volcano tearing itself apart from the inside out. Fire slammed mercilessly into ice. Kaelin's massive body convulsed on the wooden planks. His back arched off the table, a ragged, terrible sound tearing itself from his frozen throat. He was entirely unconscious, trapped in the dark void of the curse, but his nervous system recognized her. His large, blood-stained hand twitched blindly, scraping across the wood until his thick fingers desperately, instinctually locked around her wrist. His grip was bruising. It was the starving cling of a drowning man, finally finding a piece of driftwood. The intense, burning heat of the claiming mark flared between their connected skin, a golden thread trying desperately to restitch a shattered soul. Genevieve's breath hitched, a single tear of sheer, overwhelming physical overload escaping her eye as the magic peaked in a silent crescendo. A small, sudden sound broke the heavy magic. A floorboard creaked loudly near the back hallway. Genevieve snapped her head up, her lungs violently grasping for air. She instinctively severed the massive flow of healing magic, leaving only a low, steady hum of warmth radiating into his chest. She turned toward the dark archway leading to the back bedrooms. Bram stood perfectly still in the doorframe. The 5-year-old boy was clutching a small, roughly carved wooden wolf against his chest, using his other hand to rub the heavy sleep from his eyes. He had wandered out, drawn by the sudden, massive spike in the room's temperature. The boy blinked, trying to focus on the massive stranger lying on his mother's table. The firelight from the roaring hearth caught the child's face perfectly. The golden illumination flared brightly against the boy's irises. Genevieve stared at her son in the quiet, heavy aftermath of the magical eruption, her heart dropping entirely into her stomach. There was no hiding it in this light. There was no denying the terrifying absolute truth standing in the doorway. The little boy possessed the exact same rare, striking amber eyes as the unconscious king clinging desperately to her wrist. The grip on her wrist was no longer the blind reflex of a dying animal. It was a conscious, agonizing anchor. Deep beneath the layers of frost and shattered pride, Kaelin's mind was clawing its way out of the suffocating dark. The supernatural ice that had choked his veins for half a decade was violently retreating, forced backward by the scorching, golden heat pouring from the healer's hands. It felt like swallowing molten iron. It felt like breathing for the very first time. His chest heaved in a sudden, desperate spasm. The jagged breath tore through the silent cabin, loud and ragged, as the curse fought a losing battle against the ancient weaver magic. Kaelin Thorne forced his heavy eyelids open. His vision was completely blurred, swimming in a haze of copper blood and residual dark magic. The room spun in a chaotic smear of firelight and rustic timber, yet, even before his amber eyes could focus on his surroundings, his heightened predatory senses recognized the absolute truth. The scent hit him like a physical blow to the sternum. It was the distinct, intoxicating fragrance of crushed pine needles, blended seamlessly with the delicate, impossible sweetness of night-blooming moonflower. He had spent 5 years wandering the freezing, empty halls of the Obsidian Citadel, driven half-mad by the ghost of that exact scent. Now it was wrapping around him. It was real. The agonizing void in his chest, the hollow space where his mate bond had been violently severed, began to throb with a dull, terrifying ache. He blinked, clearing the dark spots from his vision. He expected to see a phantom. He expected the cruel delirium of his failing heart. Instead, he saw the face of the woman he had publicly discarded at the winter solstice banquet. Genevieve Vance was standing directly over him, her features illuminated by the roaring hearth. She was not the trembling, silk-draped girl he remembered. The woman holding him possessed a spine of absolute steel and an expression so terrifyingly calm it made his blood run cold all over again. Her bare hands were pressed flat against his ruined armor, radiating a power he could not begin to comprehend. He opened his mouth to speak her name. His throat was too ruined. Only a harsh, broken ras escaped his blue-tinted lips. Then Kaelin shifted his gaze. Standing perfectly still in the arched doorway of the back hall was a child. The 5-year-old boy was clutching a small, roughly carved wooden wolf against his chest. The child did not look frightened. He looked analytical. He looked defensive. The flickering firelight danced across the boy's features, illuminating a sharp, aristocratic jawline and a head of thick, dark hair. But it was the eyes that stopped Kaelin's ruined heart entirely. They were not the common brown or grey of the border villagers. They were a striking molten amber. They were a direct, undeniable mirror of his own soul. The realization hit Kaelin with the destructive force of a collapsing mountain. 5 years. The math was instantaneous. The brutal, devastating reality of his own colossal ignorance crashed down upon his fractured mind. The silent departure, the abandoned silver ring, the empty chambers. She had not just fled the royal court to save her own dignity. She had fled carrying his unborn heir. A guttural primal sound ripped itself from Kaelin's chest. It was a noise born of pure, possessive instinct and overwhelming grief. He ignored the catastrophic pain radiating from his ribs. He ignored the freezing curse still clinging to the edges of his aura. Driven by a blind, terrifying desperation, the massive warrior forced his battered body upward. He braced his blood-stained arm against the heavy oak table, his knuckles turning white as he attempted to assert a dominance he no longer possessed. He glared at the stoic woman standing before him, his chest heaving with exertion. He demanded an explanation. His voice was a broken, dangerous growl, commanding Genevieve to answer for the stolen bloodline. He ordered her to pack her belongings immediately. He declared that his son would not be raised in a miserable, freezing border cabin, hidden away like a shameful secret. Kaelin's tone was laced with the arrogant assumption of his absolute authority. He believed, even now, bleeding on a wooden plank, that he could simply issue a royal decree and undo the wreckage of the past 5 years. Genevieve did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. She calmly and deliberately pulled her wrist out of his bruising grip. The physical separation caused a sharp, violent sting of rejection to ripple across the severed mate bond. Kaelin gasped, falling back slightly against the wood. The quiet healer stepped out of his reach, crossing her arms over her simple wool tunic. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, not from the weather outside, but from the absolute, unyielding coldness of her stare. She looked at Kaelin not with love, nor with hatred, but with the clinical detachment of a judge delivering a final verdict. She told him he possessed absolutely no authority in this sanctuary. She told him the child standing in the doorway was named Bram, and that the boy belonged to the winter, to the mountains, and to her, never to the corrupted throne of the Obsidian Citadel. When Kaelin furiously demanded to know why she had never fought for her rightful place, why she had vanished like a coward instead of challenging his decree, Genevieve finally unbarred the heavy vault of her silence. Her voice was low, smooth, and devastatingly precise. She did not raise it. She did not need to. She explained that Odette Morvath had never been a mere political rival. Odette was an architect of slow, methodical ruin. Genevieve revealed the truth that the entire Royal Council had been too blind or too complicit to see. For months leading up to that disastrous solstice, the rival noble had been systematically poisoning the royal chalices. It was not a lethal venom designed to kill. It was a rare, insidious extract of silver ash root and ground nightshade, a dark botanical concoction specifically brewed to numb his primal instincts, rot his cognitive reasoning, and artificially induce a violent physiological revulsion toward his true mate. Kaelin's stared at her, completely paralyzed. The breath stopped dead in his lungs. Genevieve stepped closer, her grey eyes locking onto his shattered amber ones. She explained that she had discovered the foul roots hidden in the palace kitchens the very morning of the banquet. She knew the entire court was compromised. She knew that if she had stayed, if she had screamed and fought and demanded her crown, Odette would not have stopped at poisoning the wine. Odette would have eventually poisoned the food of the pregnant Luna. She had walked out into the freezing blizzard, not because she was weak, but because it was the only tactical maneuver left to ensure the survival of the twin pups growing inside her womb. A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway. She delivered the words with surgical cruelty. She told him that Odette had chosen treason, but he had chosen arrogance. He had allowed the rival noble to pour drinks. He had allowed his own ego to override the sacred, biological intuition of his wolf. He had built his own freezing prison, and she had simply refused to be locked inside it with him. Without her amber broth, he had been left to rot in the cold. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, coupled with the crushing weight of his own profound guilt, physically broke Kaelin. His broad shoulders collapsed. The terrified sovereign of the realm buried his face in his large, blood-stained hands, a low, agonizing sound of utter despair echoing through the quiet cabin. He was a man who had traded his entire universe for a poisoned cup of wine. The heavy, suffocating silence of the revelation was suddenly shattered by a high-pitched, terrifying whistle. It came from the darkness outside, cutting sharply through the howling wind. Genevieve's maternal instincts flared with violent intensity. She recognized the unnatural sound immediately. Before Cailan could even lift his head, a massive, flaming projectile smashed through the thick glass of the cabin window. The shattered shards rained down across the floorboards in a glittering, deadly shower. The projectile was not a normal arrow. It was a heavy iron bolt wrapped in pitch, sulfur, and alchemical green fire. The moment the unnatural flame touched the dry wooden floor and the bundles of hanging winter root, it erupted. The fire did not spread naturally. It crawled up the walls with predatory speed, consuming the apothecary shelves in seconds. A thick, noxious cloud of black smoke instantly filled the modest room, choking the breathable air. This was no random rogue ambush. These were Odette's elite mercenary trackers. They had followed the trail of Hess's blood directly to the northern border. Tasked with completing the treasonous coup by eliminating Cailan and silencing the fake village healer forever, absolute chaos consumed the sanctuary. From the back bedroom, a terrified, piercing scream tore through the smoke. Lyra. Genevieve did not hesitate. She sprinted toward the back hallway, her boots crunching over the broken glass. Bram was already moving, his small face set in lines of pure, unadulterated terror as he tried to run toward his sister's voice. The ceiling beams above them groaned in agony, the alchemical fire eating rapidly through the primary support structures of the roof. A massive, burning log snapped overhead, plummeting directly toward the 5-year-old boy. Genevieve screamed his name, diving across the floorboards. She grabbed the moonflower sigil, resting against her collarbone, and ripped it from its leather cord. She squeezed the ancient stone in her fist until the sharp edges bit into her palm, drawing fresh blood. She unleashed every single drop of her suppressed weaver magic. A brilliant, blinding dome of golden energy erupted outward from her body, expanding like a physical shield of hard light. The burning ceiling beam slammed violently against the magical barrier, bouncing off the golden lattice and crashing harmlessly onto the heavy oak table. The sheer physical exertion of holding the magical shield against the crushing weight of the collapsing roof brought Genevieve to her knees. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her nose began to bleed, a single dark drop falling onto the pristine white snow, blowing in through the shattered window. Behind her, Cailan forced himself upright. He was bleeding profusely from his side, his armor compromised, his heart still damaged by the curse. But the sight of his mate and his newfound son, trapped under a burning, collapsing roof, ignited a primal, apocalyptic rage within his soul. He roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain. He threw his massive hands forward, attempting to summon the lethal, freezing aura of his royal bloodline to extinguish the alchemical green flames. A wave of supernatural frost exploded from his palms, colliding with the burning walls. The ice hissed and shrieked as it met the enchanted fire. The extreme shift in temperature caused the remaining windows to blow out completely, showering the room in a storm of snow and ash. But Cailan was too weak. The long years of the curse and the severe blood loss from the ambush had drained his reserves. His legs buckled under his own weight, and he collapsed heavily onto the floorboards, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. He could only watch in sheer agony as the mother of his children sacrificed her own life force to hold the burning ceiling at bay. Then, the back door of the cabin was kicked completely off its hinges. 3 shadowy figures stepped through the roaring flames. They wore the dark, reinforced leather armor of Odette's elite guard, their faces hidden behind cruel iron masks. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision. They did not care about the collapsing roof. They were here for the bloodline. One of the mercenaries lunged toward the corner where the little girl had been hiding. Lyra was curled into a small ball, clutching her woven wool, her large eyes wide with absolute horror. Genevieve saw the masked tracker reach for her daughter. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound tearing from her throat. She tried to drop the magical shield to fight the attacker, but the moment the golden light flickered, the massive central beam of the roof cracked louder, threatening to crush both her and Bram instantly. She was pinned by her own protective magic, forced to watch her worst nightmare unfold in real time. Kaelan saw the movement. He pushed himself off the floor with the last remaining shred of his willpower. He lunged across the burning room, tackling the closest mercenary into the blazing wall. The heavy thud of armor hitting wood shook the floor. Kaelan drove his fist directly into the attacker's masked face, the sheer blunt force shattering the iron and the bone beneath it. But the victory was fleeting. A second mercenary stepped up behind Kaelan and drove the pommel of a heavy dagger brutally into the back of his skull. Kaelan's vision went entirely black. He crumpled to the floor, completely incapacitated, his blood pooling rapidly across the charred wood. The third tracker stepped over the fallen sovereign. He reached down and grabbed the screaming 5-year-old girl by the back of her heavy shawl. He hauled Lyra off the ground like a sack of grain. Genevieve's vision tunneled. The sound of the roaring fire faded into a dull, terrifying static. She watched the masked man turn on his heel, carrying her weeping daughter out through the shattered doorway and straight into the screaming jaws of the blizzard. Lyra's cries grew fainter and fainter, swallowed entirely by the howling wind. The roof could no longer hold. With a final deafening crack, the remaining timbers gave way. Genevieve grabbed Bram by the collar of his tunic, dragging the boy tight against her chest. She pushed the golden shield upward one final time, using the explosive kinetic rebound to blast the falling debris outward. The violent burst of Magicleer cleared a temporary path through the wreckage. She scrambled backward, dragging her son through the shattered front entrance and out into the freezing snow, gasping for the biting, icy air. The modest wooden sanctuary completely collapsed behind them, folding in on itself in a massive geyser of green fire and black smoke. 5 years of peace, 5 years of quiet, invisible survival, reduced to ash in less than 5 minutes. Genevieve knelt in the deep snowdrift, her arms wrapped fiercely around her trembling son. She stared at the burning wreckage of her home. The intense heat of the flames melted the snowbank around her knees. The wind whipped her loose hair across her ash-stained face. She did not cry. The sheer, unfathomable horror of losing her daughter bypassed grief entirely and settled directly into a cold, psychotic clarity. The wall inside Genevieve's chest is gone. She has not built another. A few feet away, lying half-buried in the soot and snow, Kaelan began to stir. He groaned, dragging himself out of the periphery of the flames. His face was covered in dark soot and fresh blood. He looked up at Genevieve, his amber eyes filled with a desperate, frantic panic. He looked around the ruined clearing, searching the shadows. He rasped Lyra's name, his voice completely broken. He was too late. Genevieve stood up. She released Bram, gently pushing the boy behind her legs to shield him from the wind. She walked slowly toward Kaelan. She did not offer him a hand. She did not offer him comfort. She crouched down in the snow beside him, her grey eyes devoid of any recognizable human emotion. She reached into the folds of her ruined tunic and pulled out a long, jagged shard of glass that had embedded itself in her clothing during the explosion. Without a single twitch of hesitation, she dragged the sharp edge across the palm of her left hand. A line of bright red blood instantly welled up, dripping steadily onto the pristine white snow. Kaelan stared at her bleeding hand, his pupils dilating as the scent of her royal blood hit his predatory senses. Genevieve slammed her bleeding palm directly over the open wound on his chest. Kaelan gasped, his spine arching off the frozen ground. This was not the gentle, warming magic of the healer. This was raw, ancient, and violent. It was the initiation of a strict magical blood oath contract, an irreversible binding of 2 souls for a singular, destructive purpose. She leaned down, her face inches from his, Her voice was as sharp and unforgiving as the shard of glass. She told him that Odette's mercenaries had taken the girl. She told him that Lyra possessed the same Weaver magic in her veins, leaving a faint, microscopic trail of energetic resonance in the atmosphere that only a fully merged royal aura could track through the blizzard. She explained the terms of the contract with absolute, terrifying precision. They would combine their shattered auras. They would pool their remaining strength. She would use his raw physical power as an anchor to project her tracking magic across the mountains. But she made the boundaries devastatingly clear. This forced intimacy was a tactical transaction. It was a weapon forged out of sheer necessity. It was not a forgiveness of his past sins, nor was it a bridge to rebuild their ruined bond. Not a reconciliation, a hunt. She stared into the eyes of the man who had broken her universe, demanding his vocal submission to the brutal terms. If he refused, the magic would not seal, and their daughter would vanish into the north forever. Kaelan looked up at the woman he had failed so profoundly. He felt the intense, burning heat of her blood seeping into his chest, forcibly jump-starting his failing heart. He felt the terrifying, awe-inspiring weight of her true power, a power she had kept hidden out of pure survival. He realized with a crushing finality that he had never truly known the depth of the creature he was supposed to protect. He was a broken wolf, kneeling before a resurrected queen. He raised his own trembling, blood-stained hand and wrapped his thick fingers tightly around her delicate, bleeding wrist, completing the physical circuit of the ritual. The air around them crackled with severe atmospheric pressure. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," Kaelan whispered, his voice a raw, jagged promise to the winter night. The oath accepted the submission. A blinding flash of crimson and gold light erupted between their connected bodies, snapping the fragmented pieces of their mate bond, together with the brute force of a blacksmith's hammer. The magical backlash melted the snow in a 20-foot radius, leaving them kneeling in a circle of scorched earth. The contract was sealed. The hunt had begun. The violent, magnetic tug of the blood oath contract pulled them straight into the teeth of the northern gale. It was not a gentle or guiding sensation. It was a brutal, physical tether anchored deep within the center of Genevieve's chest, dragging her relentlessly through the knee-deep snowdrifts. Beside her, Kaelan moved with lethal, terrifying silence. His amber eyes were fixed exclusively on the dark horizon, his ruined armor practically vibrating with a barely contained, predatory rage. The crippling supernatural cold that had choked his veins for 5 long years was entirely gone, burned away by the raw, intimate magic currently flowing through their merged auras. Now, only the feral instinct of a father hunting for his stolen pup remained. The blizzard screamed around them in a blinding wall of white, but the glowing crimson thread of their forged connection cut through the suffocating dark like an undeniable beacon. They marched for 2 grueling hours. The sheer physical exhaustion of the mountain ascent should have killed them both. It did not. The ancient Weaver magic sustained their bodies, feeding directly off their shared, frantic desperation. The biting wind tried to freeze the tears on the mother's face, but the internal heat of her ignited power melted the frost before it could settle on her skin. Kaelan did not speak a single word during the trek. He simply used his massive frame to break the wind, shielding her as they climbed higher into the jagged peaks. Finally, the looming silhouette of a ruined stone keep pierced the whiteout conditions. It was an ancient border watchtower, long abandoned by the royal guard and quietly claimed by Odette Morveth as a hidden sanctuary. The heavy iron portcullis was drawn tight against the stone archway. Surrounding the entire perimeter of the fortress, a sickly pulsing wall of alchemical green fire burned directly on top of the packed snow. It radiated a toxic, suffocating heat that smelled heavily of sulfur and rotted nightshade, twisting the atmosphere into a poisonous haze. Standing on the high stone parapet, shielded safely behind the unnatural flames, was Odette. She looked down at the 2 exhausted figures emerging from the storm. The traitorous woman wore a thick, luxurious cloak of sable fur, her face twisted into a mask of arrogant, desperate triumph. She held a terrified, weeping little girl suspended precariously over the edge of the stone battlement by the heavy collar of her wool tunic, Lyra. The 5-year-old was shivering violently, her small hands clutching frantically at the iron grip of her captor. Odette shouted something down over the howling wind, a venomous, hysterical taunt demanding the sovereign's absolute political surrender in exchange for the child's life. Kaelin lunged forward instinctively. The green fire immediately flared in response, rising 15 feet into the air to form an impenetrable blockade. The toxic heat scorched the edges of his dark velvet cloak, forcing him backward. He let out a guttural roar, a sound of pure, helpless agony that echoed off the canyon walls. He was physically barred from his own blood. Genevieve did not scream. She did not panic. She stepped deliberately past the towering sovereign, her leather boots sinking into the scorched, sulfur-stained earth. She tilted her head back, staring up at the woman who had systematically dismantled every pillar of her life. Odette had used the silver ash poison on the palace. She had severed the sacred mate bond. She had burned a quiet, peaceful sanctuary to ash. Stumbling blindly through life constitutes a pardonable, innocent offense. Orchestrating total devastation across a kingdom demands a ruthless, fully conscious perpetrator. And now she dared to threaten the life of an innocent child. The sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the betrayal demanded a catastrophic answering force. But the quiet healer did not reach for the golden, warming heat of her usual magic. That was the power of survival and comfort. What she required right now was the undeniable power of absolute dominion. She belonged to the winter. Genevieve raised her bleeding left hand. She closed her eyes and inhaled the freezing, biting air, drawing the absolute zero temperature of the mountain storm directly into the deepest chambers of her lungs. The glowing golden thread of her magic inverted entirely, snapping into a blinding silver-white brilliance. The atmospheric pressure around her dropped instantly. The falling snow froze completely in mid-air, suspended around her body like a million tiny, glittering glass daggers. She slammed her open palm violently against the frozen ground. A devastating, catastrophic wave of supernatural ice erupted from the point of impact. It was not the slow, parasitic frost of a dark curse. It was the absolute, sovereign authority of the winter environment itself, commanded by a rightful ruler. The shockwave of solid, crystalline ice rapidly expanded outward, crashing violently into the toxic green barrier. The alchemical fire shrieked, struggling for a fraction of a second, before the sheer, overwhelming, molecular cold shattered the defensive spell into 1,000 pieces of harmless, smoking debris. The ice did not stop. It continued upward, freezing the stone walls of the keep, locking the iron gears of the portcullis, and blowing the heavy wooden doors completely off their reinforced hinges. Odette stumbled backward on the parapet, her arrogant sneer replaced instantly by sheer, unadulterated terror. The sudden, violent destruction of her supreme magical defenses broke her concentration entirely. Her grip on the heavy wool tunic loosened. Genevieve did not wait for the dust to settle. She moved with blinding, unnatural speed, her physical body propelled upward by the lingering surge of the silver magic. She scaled the shattered stone steps of the outer courtyard, her eyes locked entirely on the sobbing form of her daughter. 3 masked mercenary trackers rushed out from the dark interior of the keep, drawing heavy steel broadswords to intercept the advancing mother. They never even took a second step. Kaelin hit their defensive front line with the destructive, unstoppable force of a falling meteor. The massive warrior did not bother using his residual magic. He used raw, unfiltered, physical brutality. He grabbed the first guard by the armored throat, lifting the grown man entirely off the ground before slamming him down across his heavily plated knee. The sickening crack of breaking bone echoed loudly over the howling wind. The second attacker swung a jagged blade toward his unprotected flank. The father caught the sharp steel edge with his bare, bloodied hand, completely uncaring as the metal sliced deep into his palm. He ripped the weapon away, driving his elbow directly into the man's iron mask with enough kinetic force to cave it inward. The third mercenary dropped his broadsword and turned to flee into the snow. Cailan tackled him brutally into a stone pillar, rendering him completely unconscious with a single, devastating blow. The courtyard was entirely secured in less than 30 seconds. Genevieve reached the high parapet. Odette was scrambling backward across the freezing stone, desperately trying to unearth another vial of liquid nightshade from the deep pockets of her furs. The weaver did not give the traitor the breath to speak. She grabbed Odette by the front of her expensive cloak and hurled her violently against the stone battlement. The brutal impact knocked the air completely out of the treacherous woman's lungs, leaving her gasping and paralyzed. Genevieve ripped Lyra from the snow-covered floor. She pulled the weeping little girl tightly against her chest, burying her face deeply into her daughter's dark, tangled hair. The sweet, innocent scent of the child filled her lungs, acting as an immediate, grounding anchor for her chaotic soul. The terrifying, sovereign ice magic instantly receded from the atmosphere, retreating quietly back beneath her skin. She was a mother again. The traumatized child wrapped her small, freezing arms fiercely around Genevieve's neck, weeping hysterically into the fabric of her ruined tunic. She closed her eyes, rocking the 5-year-old back and forth. The crushing weight of the past few hours finally caught up to her, but she refused to shed a single tear in front of her enemy. Odette lay groaning on the freezing stone. Cailan stepped heavily up onto the parapet, his massive shadow falling completely over the defeated traitor. His amber eyes burned with a lethal, unforgiving promise. His claws extended from his fingertips, dripping with the blood of the fallen guards. But he did not strike her. Death was far too quick, too merciful a release for the creature who had stolen his family and corrupted his reign. He dragged the rival up by her tangled hair, binding her wrists tightly with her own heavy leather belts. She would not die in the snow. She would face the absolute justice of the entire pack in the light of day. The long, agonizing carriage ride back to the capital was spent in heavy, exhausting silence. It took 3 difficult days to navigate the winding mountain passes with the prisoners in tow. When the heavy iron gates of the obsidian citadel finally groaned open, the sky above the kingdom was a bruised, somber purple. The massive central courtyard was packed. Hundreds of anxious wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing slush, their nervous breaths pluming in the cold winter air. They were the exact same nobles, palace guards, and council members who had watched the quiet girl walk away 5 years ago in absolute disgrace. Now they stood in stunned, breathless silence as she finally returned. Hess Caldress marched forward to officially receive the prisoners. The loyal commander looked exhausted, his right arm heavily bandaged from the initial border ambush, but a profound, overwhelming relief washed over his weathered features. He signaled a squad of the Royal Guard. 2 massive warriors hauled the bound and gagged Odette Morvath out of the secure prison wagon. The traitor was stripped of her luxurious furs, shivering violently in the mud, her severe crimes of treason and dark magic already whispered rapidly through the ranks. She was dragged roughly away to the deepest, coldest cells beneath the keep, her reign of manipulation permanently ended. Then the heavy wooden door of the royal carriage opened. Genevieve stepped out into the damp courtyard. She did not wear ceremonial white silk. She wore a soot-stained, heavily damaged wool tunic. Her silver-grey hair was tangled from the wind, and her bare hands were visibly scarred from the shattered glass and the blood oath contract. But as she stood before the grand stone steps of the palace, holding a sleeping Lyra safely in one arm, while Bram gripped her other hand tightly, she radiated an untouchable, quiet majesty. The massive crowd instinctively parted, creating a wide path. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to look her directly in the eye. The sheer weight of her silent dignity commanded absolute reverence. Cailan stepped down slowly into the slush behind her. He was the sovereign. He commanded vast armies. He ruled the largest and most terrifying territory in the Northern Hemisphere. By all the ancient laws of their strict hierarchical society, he was supposed to walk ahead of his mate, to claim his rightful throne and restore immediate order to the chaotic court. He did none of those things. Right there, in the dead center of the muddy, freezing courtyard, in front of the silent commander and the entire staring nobility, Calen Thorne collapsed to his knees. The heavy, wet thud of his body hitting the freezing earth sent a physical shockwave through the assembled crowd. His dark royal cloak dragged completely in the filth. He bowed his head deeply, his broad, muscular shoulders shaking uncontrollably. The arrogant, untouchable sovereign was openly, violently weeping. The hot tears carved clean tracks through the dried blood, soot and sweat covering his ruined face. Genevieve stopped walking. She turned around slowly, the heavy stone walls of the citadel standing as silent witnesses to the absolute reversal of her darkest night. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Instead, it had forged her into the only force capable of saving them all. "I was blind," Calen choked out. His voice was a raw, agonizing rasp, loud enough for every single wolf in the courtyard to hear with perfect clarity. He did not try to preserve a single ounce of his royal dignity. He actively and willingly destroyed it. I let a poisoned cup blind my eyes, but it was my own colossal arrogance that deafened my soul. I listened to the whispers of a traitor, instead of trusting the quiet loyalty of my rightful mate. I watched you walk out into the freezing dark, and I did absolutely nothing to stop you. He reached out with trembling, blood-stained hands, gently gripping the muddy hem of her ruined tunic. He did not dare lift his gaze to touch her skin. "I do not ask for your forgiveness," the broken man whispered, his tears falling steadily into the slush. "I do not deserve the beautiful children you kept safe in the shadows. I do not deserve the breath in my lungs, but I am begging you, before the moon goddess and this entire court, let me spend the rest of my miserable, unworthy life trying to earn a place at your feet." The silence in the courtyard was absolute. It was a terrifying, incredibly fragile thing. Everyone expected the stoic, humiliated woman to turn away to demand his permanent exile, or to exact a cruel, public vengeance upon the man who had ruined her youth. Genevieve looked down at the weeping sovereign. She saw the genuine, agonizing remorse radiating from his shattered aura. The blood oath contract binding them thrummed with a steady, profound ache, transmitting the sheer depth of his self-hatred directly into her own chest. And now, looking at the powerful warrior bleeding in the dirt, she understood the final beautiful truth of her weaver magic. Healing was not the total absence of pain. It was the deliberate, conscious choice to mend the torn threads of a ruined tapestry. "There is no wolf too broken to be worthy," she said quietly. She shifted Lyra's weight against her hip, reaching down gracefully with her scarred, unbandaged right hand. She gently touched the top of Calen's dark, tangled hair. It was a microscopic physical gesture, a single fleeting touch, but the rush of golden warmth that flowed effortlessly from her fingertips was undeniable. "Get up," she commanded softly, her tone devoid of any lingering malice. "The snow is too cold for the children." Calen let out a shattered, trembling breath. He pressed his face fiercely against her knee for one singular, desperate second, seeking comfort before rising unsteadily to his feet. He did not reach for his silver crown. He reached down and took his son's small hand, and together, the fragile, healing family walked through the heavy iron doors of the keep. Months passed. The brutal, unforgiving grip of the great frost finally yielded to a gentle thawing spring. The annual frost banquet arrived once again, marking exactly 6 years since the catastrophic fracture of the pack. But the atmosphere inside the grand dining hall was completely unrecognizable from the dark memory of the past. The oppressive, hollow dread that had once choked the massive obsidian columns was entirely gone. 6 enormous stone hearths roared with genuine crackling heat, casting a warm, golden glow over the long wooden tables. The air was filled with the bright sounds of laughter, the cheerful clinking of silver goblets, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted meats and sweet cedarwood. In the bustling palace kitchens, Martha Sterling wept openly as she carefully plated the final, most important dish of the evening. It was a large, steaming ceramic bowl of amber broth, heavily spiced and radiating a comforting, magical heat. The elderly cook wiped her wrinkled cheeks with the edge of her flour-stained apron, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, quiet joy that she had never thought she would feel again. At the head of the grand day, Genevieve sat comfortably in a high-backed wooden chair carved with the ancient crest of the pack. She was not draped in the suffocating ceremonial white silk of a sacrificial bride. She wore a simple, incredibly elegant gown of deep forest green, her silver-grey hair braided loosely and comfortably over her left shoulder. On her left side, Bram was diligently trying to cut a thick piece of roasted venison with a small silver knife, his amber eyes focused intensely on the task. On her right, Lyra was giggling uncontrollably, secretly dropping small pieces of sweet bread to a massive, lazy hunting hound resting happily under the heavy table. The heavy double doors of the kitchen swung open. Cailan walked into the crowded hall. He carried the heavy silver tray himself. The sovereign of the realm completely bypassed the line of royal servers, navigating the crowded, noisy room with a calm, steady grace. He stepped up onto the wooden dais and gently placed the steaming bowl of amber broth directly in front of his mate. He poured her dark wine. He carefully cut the tough meat for his children. He served his family with a quiet, devoted reverence that left the remaining nobles in the room in absolute awe. The terrifying ruler had become a gentle, protective harbor. When the grand meal was finally finished, Cailan did not sit down in his own high-backed chair. He turned fully to face the woman who had saved his life, his kingdom, and his fractured soul. He reached deep into the pocket of his dark velvet vest and pulled out a small, incredibly familiar object. It was the simple silver ring, the exact same band she had removed and left sitting on the cold dining table all those years ago. He had carried it in his pocket, through the suffocating dark, through the burning ice of his curse, and through the devastating fire of the mountain stronghold. Cailan stepped close to her chair. He did not kneel in the dirt this time. He stood tall, his striking amber eyes completely clear, glowing with an intense, burning devotion that needed no magic to sustain it. He reached out and gently took her left hand. He traced the faint, jagged white scar on her palm where she had cut herself for the tracking ritual, pressing a soft, deeply reverent kiss against the damaged skin. Not used, not owned, chosen. Cailan whispered, his voice trembling with a profound, beautiful emotion. "If you will still have me." Genevieve looked up into his eyes. The suffocating ice of the past was completely gone. The terrifying shadows of the rival noble and the poison had been permanently swept away. Only the steady, brilliant warmth of a rightful mate remained, waiting patiently for her final permission. She smiled. It was a small, incredibly quiet thing, but it illuminated the entire room brighter than the roaring hearths. She opened her scarred hand, and the sovereign slid the silver ring smoothly back onto her finger. The physical contact sent a brilliant, painless spark of golden light rippling rapidly across their renewed bond, sealing the spiritual connection permanently without the need for a bloody contract. The ceremonial rejection was supposed to be the moment her world shattered into an endless, freezing exile. Instead, it became the exact moment the frost finally surrendered to the undeniable warmth of a home reclaimed.